Hi, and welcome to our new episode. Today, we're finally going to talk about the mocks. Focused,
Today's the day.
yes. What we think of them? Is it a scourge of the programming, or is it something that really helps us to do a good software? I suggest to start with a definition of what we mean by mocks. What we will be complaining the most about
Yeah,
in this talk.
sounds good.
What
Yeah,
what are the mocks for you, Bart?
mocks are basically a combination of fakes and spies, essentially. Uh, it is a no-op implementation of a dependency, which you can use to validate calls to that dependencies.
Okay, yeah, I would extend this a little bit. You can use it not only to validate the calls to this dependency, but also provide some input. Not the
Yeah,
direct, but indirect, because usually when you're testing something, you're saying, okay, giving this is your input, do something further. But then
yeah,
your code under the test, it will be calling its dependencies. And when you don't want it to call the real dependency, you swap it with something, and this something can be a mock, so it will be providing the response, not only necessarily checking that it was called, but just as a part of the input.
yeah. But the mock itself will never have an opinion about this response. Only if you tell it to have one.
Yes, I think that's the most important, is that the mocks are the things that you explicitly specify for every call what will be the response. Like when this method is called with these parameters, it will return this output. Or maybe a little bit more generic, when this method is called with any parameters, just return this stuff. And this is the important difference in the discussion from fakes, I would say, some simple implementation, stubs, fakes, and so on, which has some simplistic behavior of their own. They say, okay, if you put something input, then when you're getting something, you will return you what you just put.
Yeah, exactly. Like the obvious example here is having an in-memory based repository or something like that. That's an obvious fake instead of a repository that accesses the database.
Yeah, absolutely. So
But that is indeed not a mock.
there is a little bit of a difficulty in properly naming mocks, stubs, fakes, and so on. The only thing I think we can properly easily name is spy. Spies, to clarify, is kind of a proxy around some kind of another implementation. That could be a real implementation or another fake, but this proxy can intercept the calls, and you can say, well, you know what, normally the response would be this, but now throw this exception or do this completely crazy response and see what happens.
Or you can use it for validation.
You can use it also for a validation in a transparent way, indeed. So you can still have a proper behaving or simply behaving stub, but you don't have to program it there with the validations. And just
Exactly.
a little bit probably going ahead, I actually think I like Spice. I think Spice is one of the
Okay.
potential ways to solve the mock problem. But let's
Okay.
go into the problems. What are the beauties and the ugliness of the mocks?
Conceptually, replacing a dependency in your test to isolate behavior, that makes sense. But what you often see is that you get tests that need lots of configuration of a mock, and then get it called, and then it does the validation on the mocks and the returns. And that is, I think, something that happens a lot with mocks, that you have basically a too tight coupling between your dependencies, or you're not testing those dependencies at the right level, because there's so much that you have to configure about your mock that clearly the functionality that you're testing is not independent of the state in that mock
Okay,
dependency.
so what you're saying is that when you have very huge mock configurations that you need to execute before executing a test itself, right? That's what you
Yes,
see as a problem, and the problem is basically it's a sign of the fact that your code is not well structured, right?
yes, Yes.
So, or you're testing on the wrong level of pyramid, this particular case.
Yeah, but that's usually a different side of the same coin. You're probably testing at the wrong level because you have the wrong structure.
The big advantage of the mocks is that they are very easy to use, especially nowadays. I remember the times when in Java it was a little bit cumbersome. You had mocking libraries were not that convenient. Also, you had to follow certain rules. Nowadays, you can mock everything almost like a bliss. It's like 10 years ago when I remember someone was bragging about JavaScript that they can mock everything easily because they just can replace the value in every object and that's it. And I thought, oh, okay, I don't know whether I like it or not, but now I have more or less the same, almost the same in Java as well. So this is it, and I think that's a powerful thing, but also very, very, very big cons because we are getting accustomed to use those mocks everywhere, all the way to DTOs. And there, the problems start to fall upon us. Okay, they're easier to write. It's very easy. You just say, okay, respond this thing. But maintaining becomes more difficult. If you have more than one test testing something, to keep it consistent so that you are providing the real inputs and outputs to the code, it can be quite a daunting challenge. And I see often in the code bases that there are lots of tests that are driven by mocks that very quickly just lose most of the coupling to the reality. So that they mocking the requests and responses that will never happen. Not realistic behavior. A recent example from my experience I can provide. I was refactoring a code. Well, I found a code that was actually refactored already. So it was originally just one method that was doing something and updating two entities. And then for resilience and other reasons, there was a queue inserted in between to update one thing and then there was a fan out 1 to n. But then the queue, in the spirit of mocks, was fully mocked.
But if we look at this particular refactor of introducing a queue between these two steps, you're basically decoupling the two steps. So isn't it actually rather realistic that there is now a delay and a decoupling between the state of the result of the first state and the input state of the second phase?
Yes, actually, I was wrong a little bit in describing the situation. The original tests, they were working with the whole step.
Right.
After migration, they started still to work with the whole step. Just in the middle, they would be mocking the responses on queuing and dequeuing.
Ah, okay. Yeah.
And then instead of just passing what the first thing gave to the second, so that is a higher level test. Instead of just passing what was there by using some simple fake like a queue or whatever, because it was all manually coded, there were lots of inconsistency crippling over the time.
Yeah, exactly. What you then have basically is that your mock is mimicking the behavior that's actually internal to the process that you're testing.
Yes.
And
internal or even external, but still it's inconsistent.
Yeah, and indeed, and what you then basically get is that you're testing test code and not the production code, essentially.
Well, that's that's another side also. That's when we have too many dependencies, too many mocks. I think that's that we can have it as a separate item, because this first one for me is testing unrealistic scenarios where you could very much easier replace the mock with some simple implementation, do much more coding in your test, just give a pipe and instead of real queue, and that's it. And that's on the higher level. Another problem, I think, on the lower especially level, on the unit level, is basically that the mocks, because they're so easy to use, they completely eradicate the need for, they completely eradicate the TDD drive for good design.
Yeah, exactly. I think that is one of the main downsides of tests as well, of mocks. I mean, that they hide away this power that tests have to force you to think about your design. Yeah, and also like for enabling like bad behavior, it's also mocks that enable lots of the bad tests. There's lots of unit tests that's like mock in, validate that what you pass from the mock comes out of your actual test, and check that on the mock. And it is truly the mocks that enable these kind of pointless tests. And
yes, in the extreme examples, yes, you can see the tests that basically say I'm testing something, and when you look what it tests, it just has lots of calls and all of them are mocked. So it just tests that the mocks are working and that your code is passing the data from one mode to another
exactly.
without changes. Perfect.
And your coverage report says it's okay. Yeah. It's like
another big problem for me with mocks, with heavy mocking, is its resilience for a change, especially when you do a change within the boundary of your test. I think that's
you
a little
mean
bit
resistance against change? Because
yes, resistance against change. What did I say?
okay, resilience for change, which
No, that's
seems
incorrect.
like a good thing. No, yeah, okay.
Well, depending on defining what you of your definition, resilience to a change, but
Yeah,
yes,
yeah, no,
they are very resistant. They're adding lots of artificial resistance. And my previous example was one of those. So when you introduce something in between, then suddenly you need to go and program those things instead of if you were using some in-memory queue or just a realistic queue. And as examples, if you have some code and you do something in one place and you decide, okay, now I will do it in another place. Like earlier we were doing some enrichment in the earlier stages, but now we want for some reason do it in the later stages. And then if you're working with the mocks, again, you need to go through every test that was calling that enrichment on something and reprogramming it or move it to the second page station. Most of the time when you're working other techniques, which we'll discuss in the second video, you can work this around.
Yeah, okay, because I think we've been discussing on downsides quite a bit. But I think there's two interesting angles that we should take to go further. One is like, when should you use mocks? What is actually
when they're good?
Mocks?
Yes, when they're good.
Yeah, and the other is what's the alternative? What's
what are the fixes for this problem?
Thanks everyone for joining us for another friendly tech chat, and we'll see you next time for some more deep dives on the wonders of mocks.
Yes, and how to fix them.